Welcome. Today I want to talk to you about my game against the Armenian Grandmaster Rafael Vaganian. Vaganian is known as a very gifted chess player. He's also known to be extremely strong in blitz, even stronger maybe than in normal chess, where he was already a top 50 player for a long time. And even in his mid-50s, he was still in the top 50 of the world rankings. So this qualifies him as a legend for the purpose of this channel. And moreover, he was a legend of the Bundesliga. So this game took place in the Bundesliga when he was already in his 50s, but was still rated above 2600. And in the Bundesliga, he scored always amazing results for SG Ports. And in particular, in 1 year, he scored 14.5 out of 15 games, a score which I think has never been repeated since this amazing achievement. And since he lived in Cologne, close to where I was born, I always looked up to him. So I was extremely happy to get the opportunity to play against this Bundesliga legend one day in the very Bundesliga. So in this game, he opened with d4, and I went for a setup as a Grunfeld defense. And in particular, now I decided to go for the move d5. So I think nowadays many players with black do not play this line anymore, but go for a more safe line with c6 and d5. But I always had quite a lot of success with this line, so I just thought, okay, I will also play it against Vaganian. He took and went for knight f3. I think this is still a completely normal and playable line nowadays. Knight c3. Now after knight c6, white goes e3, protecting the pawn on b4. And I went for castles. So after castles, black now has the option of going e5. So I think this was what people played many years ago. And then there was the old main line with d5, e5, and e4. But I think this was not what I played at the time. And I think also this has not the best reputation nowadays in terms of playability. So instead, I went for the move rook e8. And that's a position where where kind of both sides can make a lot of waiting moves. And I think nowadays that's one of the reasons why black does not play this as much anymore, because now white has a lot of options. So white can either go like rook e1, which is a useful waiting move. White can play knight h4, which is a useful waiting move. You can even go something like a3, I guess. So another useful waiting move. And then often you transpose back in these lines with e5, d5. And the question is now, is rook e8 more useful in these lines than rook e1 or a3 and so on? So there's a lot of subtleties there, and I didn't really follow the theoretical details in the last years, but I know that this line is still played sometimes. Many black players nowadays go for the more solid c6 and d5 option. Well, in any case, Vaganian didn't play any of these waiting moves, but directly went for the move d5, which I guess was also topical at the time when the game was played. And after knight a5, he went for knight d4, which has the main idea to prevent me from going c6. So he now attacks the square on c6 with 3 pieces, and therefore I cannot go c6 anymore. So I went for bishop d7. Now the black plan is to go either c6 immediately or queen c8 followed by c6. So as white cannot really prevent that, white just goes for development and grabs some space with the move e4, and black plays c6. He went for rook e1. This is still some theoretical line, and I took on d5, and he just took back. So I think in this position, I deviated from the main line theory at the time, and I think that's still quite playable for black, this line. So rook c8, for instance, is a fine move, or also queen to c8, maybe sometimes has the idea of going bishop h3. But I didn't choose for any of these two options, but instead went for the move knight a to c4. So well, I thought the knight on the rim looks a little bit dim, and so I would like to ideally place it on a better square on d6, where it blocks the pawn and where also restricts the potential of movement of this bishop on g2. Vaganian played move b3, and I just went back to d6. Well, now he went for bishop b2, normal developing move. And I mean, white has this isolated pawn on d5, which restricts the movement of the bishop a little bit. In fact, it's in the Grunfeld often also a strength for white because it gives you a lot of space. So the fight here, the strategic battle, is that I have less space, but he might have this small weakness on d5. So that's the topic of the game for the moment. I went for knight f5 for that reason. So if you have less space than your opponent, it's often a good idea to exchange pieces. And that's why I thought, well, I go knight f5. If he exchanges, I get bishop f5 in, and maybe also get some pressure on the diagonal here. Instead of exchanging, he went for a more natural move with knight c2 e2, defending on d4. And in this position, I remember I started thinking, and then I came up with a relatively creative solution. And yeah, maybe you can also take a moment and you can think about which piece is black's worst piece at the moment. So which piece does not really play for black? Well, and the answer is this knight on b6 doesn't do anything. So the knight looks, on the one hand, it looks against this pawn, which it can never take. On the other hand, there's no way of improving the knight via c4 or a4 because these squares are also protected by the pawn on b3. And therefore, I decided to keep this tension on this diagonal and just bring knight to more fertile grounds by the move knight c8. Yeah, now I will bring the knight to d6, and that's also what happened in the game. So he went for queen d2, and I played knight d6. Yeah, and here he just played rook c1. He still has a small advantage in terms of development. I mean, he already has developed all his pieces, whereas my queen on d8 and the rook on a8 are not yet playing, so he has a small advantage there. But I think the position is still quite playable for black anyhow. And during the game, I remember I was quite happy with my position. So queen b6. And now he decided to take, which makes a lot of sense because he now wants to do something quickly against my position and not allow me to go rook c8, which then would probably lead to equality. So I took back. He exchanged the bishops. So I mean, in principle, this bishop is on g7 is a piece which gives me a lot of control over the position. So it makes a lot of sense for him to exchange that one. Yeah, and here I think we reach maybe the first, or one of the first critical positions of the game. And he decided to play queen c3. And the computer gives a very funny move for white, and a move which I think virtually no human would consider in this position. And the move is the move g4. What's g4 all about? Well, it attacks the knight. So if the knight goes back to d6, then it makes some sense that you play g4 because the knight is quite restricted in terms of movement from d6. Again, it's not feasible to go to e4, c4, f5, or any other square. And therefore, the most natural reply to g4 would be knight to h4. Yeah, this now seems to hit both the bishop on g2 and the pawn on g4 with the bishop. So it feels like g4 is not the most smart idea in the world, but the computer backs it up quite tactically here. So by just going rook c4, also computer says that white now might get an attack on the king in some lines. And that even if I take, he can just keep the structure with the rook on c4 for the time being and enjoy a little bit of a space advantage. And the other move, which the computer I think also suggests, is a move like knight to g3, and even sacrifice this pawn, and after bishop takes g4 to go something like rook c4, and then with the idea to attack again via the H file, yeah, which is again not something that a human player would come up with. So I think maybe objectively G4 is quite strong here and might lead to a small advantage for white. But as I said, that's not something a human player would necessarily consider. And my opponent played Queen C3 check, which is the move that I was also expecting. I just went back to G8. And now if I get one more move in with Rook AC8, it's clear that black cannot be worse anymore, because I gained control over the last entry square, and I can at any point in time move my knight back to D6 if I really need to, and D5 might in the end turn out to become a weakness. So he went for Queen C7. I have to protect, and now just Knight F4, reinforcing the position of his knight. And now pretty much the next sequence of moves is forced. So I went for Rook C8, forcing him to take. And now he played the move D6. Yeah, so now this gets a little bit more concrete. Black wants to go knight to D6, and then black is fine. So maybe something like King F8, Knight D6, then exchange all rooks. And in the end, maybe I can play against this pawn on D5. But I think also this position is just very close to a draw. So instead of going for that, of course, as he's the way stronger player than I am, he went for the move D6. And now, I face a difficult decision. And I remember I took a lot of time here, and I'm not sure which move is better. So I think both alternatives are playable. So one option would be to go for rook takes on C1, then just taking back on D6. So I saw that, and I was a little bit afraid of knight to D5. Knight to D5 hits both E7 and E6. And probably I now have to go back and play the very passive move, knight to C8. And while the computer gives this position as being equal, when I calculated it, I was not entirely comfortable with it, and therefore I didn't go for it. So if black gets one more move in with bishop C6 right now, then I get why it's equal. And so the computer says there could be some repetition, like knight b4 attacking the b7 pawn, and now like knight d6, knight d5, and knight c8 with a repetition. But so in this position, this was not necessarily super easy for me to calculate. And thus instead I went for an ending which I thought would be a relatively straightforward draw, just going e6. So now d6 becomes a weakness. It's very, very difficult for him to prevent knight takes d6 in the next move. So he took on b7, and I took this pawn on d6. Well, he played bishop g2. That makes a lot of sense. Now I have to play king f8 once, because after rook c8 he has rook d1. So I play king f8 to bring my king to e7. And now after knight d3, I exchange the rooks. And we reached this endgame, which is kind of the beginning of a long suffering for me. Actually, when we reached the endgame, I thought, well, maybe I'm a little bit worse, but I should hold it without major issues. But I was wrong. So in fact, the position is maybe just slightly worse for black, but it's really, really unpleasant to play. So he went for f4, grabbing control over the dark squares. And now, my bishop on c8 is on the same squares as my pawns, on the same color as my pawns, and his bishop on g2 is a way stronger piece. On top of that, he has this minority advantage of having 2 versus 1 on the queen side. So white has quite a few strategical trumps here, and it turns out that this position is not so easy to play. So objectively, probably black should go something like f6, putting pawns on dark squares. Maybe later on go h6 and g5, king e7, and just wait. I think this is objectively the best setup. And while black is still a little bit worse, I think it should lead to a draw. What I did instead is kind of fake activity. So I went for bishop a6, which maybe looks decent. My idea was that after knight e5, maybe you can just go king e7, then f6, kick the knight away, and things are going fine. Instead, he played a very smart move right here, namely the move knight to b2. So now the knight is regrouping and wants to attack my pawn on e6. It's surprisingly difficult now for black to defend this position. I went for king e7, and now both sides bring their king. He activates his knight, and I don't really want to go b5 here, because then I have the next pawn on white squares, and of course this also leads to even more activity for white after knight c5 and bishop c8. And now this position is definitely at least clearly better for white, if not winning. Maybe white can just go a4 here as well, build a passed pawn, and it's very, very hard for black to defend this. So therefore, after knight a4, I defended passively with knight c8. But here it now dawned on me that it's very tough for me to defend the position, especially against such a strong player like Vaganian. So he went for king e3, and now just knight c3 back. Well, problem for me is now that I can't go knight d6 because my king is blocking that square, and he will go knight e4 check eventually, and just maybe b4, a4, and attack me on both wings. Yeah, so here already it is definitely not an easy task to defend the position for black. I would think that probably something like king c7 would be the best option, at least preparing to go knight d6 in the next move. And something like knight e4 is still met with bishop b7. So I have the feeling that this is probably black's best choice, and white is clearly better, but it's not clear if that's enough for a win or not. Instead, I went for h6. Now finally putting my pawns on dark squares. White's attack on the queen side now rolls with the moves b4 and a4. And after bishop c4, he decided to go for knight e4 check. Now forcing my king to retreat to e7, and now he just went back. Knight to d2, another very strong move. And now he asked me the question, what does this bishop want to achieve? Well, I mean, I could go to a2, but this looks doesn't look too nice, to be honest. I mean, he can just go king d4, and now I can't really oppose on d6 anymore because this always runs into knight e4 check. And it's clear that white is pressing and probably also winning. Going back to a6 also does not look very nice for similar reasons. And on top, at any point, he could come with b5. So I decided, as ugly as it looks, I will go for bishop d5. But here it's clear that white is pressing, and it's really tough not to defend. He took. And now I have this isolated pawn on d5, and he will get a passed pawn on the a file eventually, if he wants to. So he instead decided to go for a concrete solution here, namely to play the move king to d4. In the game I played knight c6 check, so we will see the more concrete line later on. So let's first check what happens if he just goes king d6. So if I just went king d6, he can go knight to f3. And now let's say after check, he can just move his king back with knight d4 and then build a passed pawn. And white is just almost winning in this ending where he has the passed pawn on the a file, and I have my passed pawn just on the d file, which is on top blocked, and I can't do that much. So I decided, well, I don't want to slowly lose the game. At least I want to give him a tactical fight and force him to calculate some lines. And the way I did it is to just go knight c6 check. And now I went back to a6. So in any case, he will go king b5, king b6, and take my pawn. So I thought, well, instead of giving up the pawn, I have a nice motive to fight on. So maybe you can think about it for a second. and then think about one of black's best options here. Well, maybe you stopped the video and you came up with the same resource that I did, namely knight a6, and after knight c5, he cannot take on b6 because the pawn on a4 would be falling with a draw. So white has to go a5. But well, what did I achieve by that? Next move he will take on b6 and then the game is decided. Well, actually not, because I will just take on a5. So I sack my knight, and now the basic motive that I have is that a knight in such endgames is not a very good piece to defend against the king. So if you have pawns on just one flank, it's always a drawing idea to sacrifice a knight if afterwards you can play with the king and pawns on one flank against the pawns on the same flank. And so if this king is too far away, then black has reasonable drawing chances. So just one line to illustrate it. I played king e6 in the game, so if now white goes after the pawn on a5, I suspect that both king f5 but also king d5 would be decent moves, and I will just run now. And yeah, the knight is really a bad piece here to defend these pawns. And thus he decided to defend the pawns with the king, to go king d4. But the point now is that my pawn on a5 is sort of playing against his knight. And on the king side we have 3 versus 3. So I thought the ending should be losing for me, but I also thought that it's not yet completely over. Okay, we played a few more moves on the king side. And now finally I played the move a4, forcing him to play knight to c4. Yeah, and in this position I went for g5, which is a decent move, trying to exchange more pawns. And yeah, he can never really bring his knight to the king side, so we'll see this in the game. So let's say king f3, king g6, and he can never really bring the knight, because whenever he brings the knight I go a3. So he has to think about something else, and it's not so easy. So one natural solution might be to go king e4 here, and after f5 to just go king e5. Then I have h4. So he pretty much has to take, and after takes, we just go king h5, taking the h4 pawn, king g3 and f4 check. And at some point he will have to take the pawn, and the game will end in a draw. So it's not so easy for him. So natural sequences like this, king e4, do not work. So he went for something else, namely just going h4. And I now took on h4 and played the move king f5. Yeah, and so in this position he didn't choose the right plan. So actually there is one very forced sequence of moves which would now lead to a win. So maybe you can pause the video again and try to find the winning sequence for white. Well, the sequence starts with a move knight to a3. And now the point is that white's king will become quite active. So if I go f5, he can go king d4. And then just wait and eventually collect the pawn. So the most direct sequence would now be king d6. Now there's a very, very linear line, which could be calculated here, I guess. Takes king b4. Now he has to play knight b1 to win one tempo. And now he can just sacrifice this knight on b1, because otherwise the a pawn is running. So we could just go king g6, takes, and now we are both queening. But after check, takes, king takes h5, white wins because the king goes away and the pawn is eventually going to promote. Yeah, so that was a pretty long sequence. I mean, 12 moves. I think a player of the caliber of Vaganian should be able to calculate this. And so I thought why he made the mistake was more that he was not really willing to calculate at all at that point, but he thought the position is probably winning just in a strategical way, but it turns out that that's not the case. So he went for knight e3, king e5, and yeah, here now I think this was the last chance for him to win by actually just going back knight to c4 or something like king e4. Instead, he went for knight to c2, which now allows me to run to the queen side with my king. And after king c4, he has two options. Either he can now again try a similar running game as the one we have seen by king e4. We will see this in a moment. Or he could go king d2. So I think this was probably what he had planned. And the point is that if I go king d3 in such a position, he can always go king d3. I can never go a3 because he can just take. After king d2, I can play f5. Very strong move. And it's essentially a Zugzwang position for white right now. If he runs to the queen side, I can just go king d3 and so on. And if he tries to collect my pawns, the king can just run. Takes and king e4, check, king f4, and just now go to e4 and eventually collect the h4 pawn with a draw. So he saw this right now and was visibly disappointed. Played the move king to e4, king c3, and now if we play the same running game as before, takes, now I'm too tempy, quicker than before, and I will actually queen first and win the game. So therefore he could not do that anymore. But after king c3, he now had to circle around with a knight. Knight a3, king b3, and so this is a famous position where you just have the king and the a pawn against the knight, with the king on the other wing. This is just known to be a draw because the knight can circle around. So for instance, now go back to a3, or even to d6, as we will see here. So king c5, and now he just went to f5. But yeah, this was just another way of making a draw. So he could just go back and forth to make a draw, because now he wants to go back to c2 to then stop the pawn with a move knight to c2 and to stop the pawn from queening on a1. And I think this would have been another draw to just go a3, a2 here, but I decided to actually go king c4. And after the check, he played king d3 and offered me a draw. Yeah, so I accepted the draw, and well, I mean, how would the game end? At any time I can go a3. Let's say knight c2, a2. And now he can just wait. And yeah, he can just wait forever if he wants, and we just go back and forth. Or he could even, if he fancies, play the move knight to a1, and the game would end in a stalemate. Well, this was quite an interesting game for me because I thought that I should have the ending under control. I mean, of course, I knew how strong he was, and I thought I have to be careful, but I should be able to secure a draw. Then he managed to outplay me with this very, very nice move, knight b2. And the following sequence he played really well up until this ending, this knight ending. In the knight ending, I think I made a very good practical decision to give up the knight, although this was objectively losing. It posed him some real problems, and it really forced him to calculate lines. And in the end, he failed to convert that. I think this was quite lucky for me, to be honest, against such a strong player. But maybe what you can take away from it is this motive of sacrificing the knight in endgames, when this enables you to play with a king against a knight and just pawns on the same flank. This is quite often a motive where you can still secure a draw. Yeah, so that's it from me for today, and I hope you enjoyed the video. See you next time.
When you have stress, play chess. When you fall on your ass, play chess for a real deal, for Christian Seel.